I'm Pauline Lord. I'm going to talk to you about my grandparents, Henry F. DuPont and Ruth Wales DuPont, and their life here in Boca Grande. H.F. DuPont and his bride had several habitations, most famous of which was Winterthur, Delaware, but also Chestertown House in Southampton, Long Island, and they had a large apartment in New York. Those lives there were fairly formal and heavily staffed. So coming to Boca Grande was kind of a break from that. And the rhythm of their year included, importantly, New Year's Eve dinner, where terrapin soup was always featured and caviar. And then New Year's Day was this unusual custom unique to the DuPonts, which was called calling. And that was on the anniversary of the landing by Pierre, let me see, who was it? The first DuPont, Pierre Samuel DuPont, and his sons Eleuther and Irénée in 1800 on New Year's Day. So anyway, fast forward, calling involves all the DuPont women and girls staying or getting all dressed up in the several DuPont chateau-like mansions, and the men and boys pile into limousines with the trunks full of candy, especially this fabulous Drosti chocolate I was fond of, and other goodies, and they were driven around from house to house and came into the vestibule with many shouts of "Happy New Cousin," and there they were plied with drink. So we received waves of increasingly inebriated cousins, none of whom I ever knew, arriving and making merry. It was quite an event. Luckily, I haven't had to do that as an adult, but in any event, once calling was over, my grandparents could focus on coming to Boca Grande. So they commandeered 3 train cars to get here. Of course, they needed, my grandparents and their 2 daughters, Pauline and Ruth, needed their own car. And then there was a car for the retinue, which was much reduced from the rest of their lives, but did feature a butler, a cook, 2 footmen who doubled as chauffeurs, and of course they had other people as well. They had a caretaker for the properties and such. So they needed their own train car, and then naturally there was a train car for all the clothes and the food and just everything one needed to really move an entire operation here to Boca Grande. So their lives here were quite social. They had friends right around here. Grandpa's sister, Louise DuPont Crowninshield, and her husband, Frank, lived right next door. They had dear friends named the Haskells, and a wonderful friend of my grandfather's, Joe Swan, lived on the corner of 3rd and the Gulf. So they had people in the vicinity that were a lot of fun for them. And I have a bit of a Haskell story for you, because my mother played all the time with her cousin, with her friend, Hal Haskell, son of my grandparents' friends, here in the Sea Grapes, and they also played at their own places back in Delaware and Pennsylvania. My mother at Winterthur and Hal at Hillgirt Farm in Chadds Ford. Anyway, so they were great friends. Then, of course, they grew up, went their separate ways, married, had children, and all this stuff. And way late in life, Hal was down here on a business trip. His wife, Mimi, was mortally ill with cancer, and he got done with his business early, so came down to the old haunt to just kind of see how things were. and he was sitting at the sea wall, sort of head in hands, watching the sun set into the Gulf, when this form clambered up the ladder right next to him, wearing her trademark bathing cap and that two-piece bathing suit she'd perhaps bought at Bonwit Teller a couple of decades previously. He turned to my mother and said, "DuPont, Haskell." And my mother went, "Oh, Hal, let me get cleaned up and come over for a dividend," which was a word for a drink. They became reacquainted. Mimi sadly died, and they had a ceremony a year or so later, making them partners for life. The thing Grandpa also loved to do was have rather formal lunches. So he would invite people to lunch. He was at 12:30 on the dot. He was an extremely punctual fellow, so you couldn't be a minute early, and you certainly mustn't be a minute late. So people would arrive for this lunch and at the door at my grandfather's house, and if they were early, they would start to promenade back and forth on the street, and no doubt run into the others similarly promenading. And then everybody would have to gather right at the front door and try to squeeze in there. It was a tiny vestibule, so that was quite a challenge, with the butler sort of opening the door and being like that. And there would be some footman with a platter of drinks, so you were to sort of down your drink, because then you had to go in and sit down at the table. And then there was a certain time when you must be gone entirely. I believe it was 2 o'clock sharp. So those were closely structured meals. Now, when we came here for spring break, which was the most fun part of my year ever, we stayed in the house back here. And it was just a rather simple fisherman's house to which my grandfather had added a wing that was was entirely for the help. He had them in other houses as well, by the way. He owned quite a few houses on Banyan Street, and the caretaker had a house on Gilchrist Avenue. But this was a house that my mother and my aunt had occupied when they were girls with their governess. So this house was always called the children's house, referring to my aunt and my mother. So we would be here, our family of 5, my mother, Ruth, her husband George, and my brothers and me. And we would come over every day to my grandparents for lunch, which you would think would be sort of a great thing, but for one element in the lunch, which was every single time this substance that my parents thought and grandparents thought was ambrosia. It was so delicious. They went on and on about it. It was Donax soup. Donax are those tiny little clam-like multicolored shellfish that burrow down into the sand right there. Every single morning, the butler, Emil, would be down at the beach gathering the Donax for the luscious soup. Well, I hated Donax. It was vile. So I couldn't bear it. And of course, I was closely supervised by the adults, making sure I was going to eat every bite. So I made a pact with the cook to please give me chicken broth instead. The jig was up when the butler failed to pass me the sour cream that was meant to go in the Donax soup then. So we went to dinner across the way most evenings. And the thing I remember most about dinner really was that after dinner, we would climb the narrow stairs up to the room above that featured a piano. And in that room, the men, I think, were smoking cigars in there, if you can believe it, in this day and age. And everybody was drinking coffee or brandy, except for the children, of course. My grandmother would sit down at the piano with her legs akimbo, as she liked to always sit, sort of like that, and belt out these great songs. Each one was slightly weirder than the next. One of the themes of the songs was drunken men and women trying to get control of them. And there was one that I was particularly fond of that went like this. Well, this was kind of the refrain. Heinz, Heinz, what's the matter with Heinz? Heinz is wobbling down the street. What's the matter with Heinz's feet? Ach, Gott, that's the trouble with men. He's been to 57 bars and Heinz is pickled again. And we all just love that song. So anyway, there was one very special night when we were called after, it was just about our bedtime. I guess maybe they called us on the telephone. The word was we had to go back over to the dining room. And my grandfather had collected, or had somebody pick, the elongated buds of the shaving brush tree, and there was a holder in the middle of the table with holes in it, presumably with water in the container, with these hot dog-like buds sticking right out of this thing. And we sat there mesmerized while each one opened up these glorious pink flowers in front of our eyes. It was quite spectacular. Behind our house here was a special little house where all the linens, the bed linens and the table linens, were all washed by hand in 2 deep sinks. So and we still have those deep sinks right here. We're not washing in them anymore, mostly. But it's kind of a cool feature that we still have. So I want to tell you more about how hard it was to understand my grandfather. My mother, never really understood that he was completely unintelligible to the average person. I mean, she'd grown up with him, so she could understand him, but I just think it was kind of strange. So in any case, I never was tipped off by my mother that he was hard to understand. Sophie DuPont told the story of Grandpa going to shop. He was driven by his chauffeur to an antique store. And Grandpa got out of the car, disappeared into the store, was there for a while, and after a while he came out with a large china bowl. And I should say, not only was he hard to understand, he was absolutely adamant that you immediately do whatever he told you to do. No ifs, ands, or buts. So he had this bowl in his arms, he handed it to the chauffeur, his driver, and said what the driver took to be, take this and throw it over the fence. And then immediately Grandpa disappeared back into the shop. So the driver looked around, indeed there was a fence there. He walked over to the fence, chucked it over. It smashed into about 1 million pieces. And after a spell, my grandfather re-emerged from the shop and said, "Where's my bowl?" The driver led him to the fence and showed him the many shards on the ground. And it turned out that wasn't at all what he'd said. What he had said was, "I bought this in self-defense." So that's kind of a lot of what I have to tell you about my grandparents' life down here. I think it was a wonderful life, and they had a wonderful time.